Job says in Job 121, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Tonight, remember that God is still present, even while you are walking through difficult seasons. Let the power and the presence of God calm your heavy heart tonight. And let this story remind you that faith can still survive even the darkest storms. The Bible tells the story of Job, a story of faith, suffering, endurance, and of a man whose life would one day be tested beyond anything he could have imagined. Long ago, far beyond the crowded cities and powerful kingdoms of the ancient world, there was a quiet land known as Uz, a peaceful land of open fields. Rolling hills, distant mountains, and long desert roads stretching beneath endless skies in the mornings. Soft winds moved gently across the earth, while the first light of dawn slowly touched the hillsides. And at night, the stars shined brightly above the land, like countless lights scattered across the heavens. Everything in Uz seemed to move slowly, peacefully, as though time itself had softened beneath the quiet rhythm of the land. And it was in this quiet place that a man named Job lived, a man respected throughout the land, not because he was a king, and not because he led armies into battle, but because he was known as a man of integrity, honest in his words, patient in his decisions, and faithful in the way he lived before God. Those who knew Job often spoke of his wisdom quietly, almost reverently, for peace seemed to follow him wherever he went. He listened carefully before speaking, treated people fairly, and carried himself with calm humility, even with great wealth and influence. There was nothing prideful about him, nothing harsh, nothing careless, only a quiet strength that others naturally trusted. As the years passed, Job's life became greatly blessed. His household grew large, his lands expanded across the countryside, and his servants worked throughout the fields with diligence and order. Sheep covered the hillsides like drifting clouds upon the earth. Camels rested beside ancient trade routes, and oxen moved steadily through fertile ground beneath the warmth of the rising sun. Yet despite all he possessed, Job remained humble, for he understood that peace was more valuable than riches, and wisdom far greater than power. Each morning, before the busy hours of the day began, before merchants opened their markets, before shepherds crossed the distant hills, and before the sounds of labor filled the land, Job would rise quietly in the stillness of dawn and spend time in prayer. In those early morning hours, while much of the world still slept beneath fading stars, Job would lift his thoughts toward God, not asking for fame, not seeking greater wealth, but praying for wisdom, for protection, and for peace over the people he loved. For Job cared deeply about his family. His sons and daughters often gathered together inside their homes to share meals, laughter, stories, and the simple joy of being together. Warm lantern light flickered softly against stone walls, while music and conversation drifted gently through the evening air. And after these gatherings ended, when the night had grown quiet once more, Job would pray again on behalf of his children, for in his heart he desired that they remain close to God in all they did. The seasons continued peacefully in the land of Uz. Mornings came and went beneath golden sunlight. Cool evenings settled gently across the hills, and the stars continued their silent journey across the heavens night after night. From a distance, the life of Job appeared calm, stable, and deeply blessed. A life untouched by sorrow, untouched by suffering, untouched by loss. But beyond the sight of mankind, beyond the quiet deserts and peaceful hills of Uz, far above the earth itself, a greater story had already begun to unfold, a story that would soon test the very foundation of Job's faith and change his life forever. In the land of Uz, the name of Job was spoken with deep respect, not only because of the wealth he possessed, but because of the kind of man he had become. Many men throughout the world gained riches, many gained influence, and many gained power. Yet very few carried those blessings with humility. But Job was different. The people who worked beside him trusted him. Travelers spoke well of him along distant roads. And families throughout the region viewed him as a man of wisdom. For whenever conflict arose, Job listened carefully before speaking. And whenever others acted with pride or anger, he answered with patience and calm restraint. There was something steady about him, something peaceful, as though his heart was anchored deeper than the temporary things of the world. As the days passed quietly across the land, Job continued living with discipline and reverence toward God. In the mornings, before the heat of the desert settled upon the hills, he walked slowly through his fields, observing the work being done throughout the countryside. Servants moved carefully among the animals. Shepherds guided their flocks through open pastures, and the sounds of daily life slowly awakened beneath the rising sun. Yet even in the middle of great responsibility, Job never allowed success to harden his heart. He treated those beneath him with fairness, spoke honestly in his dealings, and remained mindful that every blessing in his life had been given by God. For Job understood something many people forget during seasons of prosperity. That wealth can disappear, power can fade, and comfort can change like shifting sand beneath the wind. At times, travelers passing through Uz would pause beneath shaded tents to rest from the long desert roads. And many of them would hear stories about Job from the people of the land, stories of his generosity, his wisdom, and the peaceful order surrounding his household. Some spoke of the way he helped others quietly without seeking recognition, while others admired the discipline and integrity that shaped every part of his life. And as evening approached each day, The warm glow of lanterns slowly appeared throughout the countryside, while cool winds drifted across the hills beneath an endless sky of stars. Within the home of Job, laughter and conversation often filled the night air as his children gathered together to celebrate life. Yet even during moments of joy, Job remained spiritually watchful. For after these gatherings ended, he would once again spend time in prayer, quietly lifting his family before God, desiring peace, wisdom, and protection over those he loved. And so the years continued peacefully in the land of Uz, the mornings calm, the evenings gentle, and the life of Job appearing secure beneath the blessings surrounding him. From the outside, everything seemed stable, untouched by sorrow, untouched by suffering, as though the quiet rhythm of his life might continue forever. But beyond the understanding of mankind, beyond the peaceful deserts and silent hills stretching beneath the night sky, unseen events were already beginning to move, and soon the faith of Job would face a trial unlike anything he had ever known. Far beyond the deserts of Uz, beyond the hills, the distant trade roads, and the quiet homes resting beneath the stars, there existed a realm unseen by human eyes, a place beyond the understanding of mankind, where the presence of God stretched across eternity itself. And while life continued peacefully upon the earth below, something far greater was quietly unfolding beyond the sight of men. For there came a moment, hidden from the world, when a conversation began in the heavens concerning Job. The Bible tells us that among the heavenly beings standing before God, Satan also came before him. And the Lord spoke of Job with approval, describing him as a man unlike many others upon the earth, blameless in his character, upright in his ways, faithful before God, and careful to turn away from evil. But Satan answered by questioning the sincerity of Job's faith, suggesting that Job remained faithful only because his life had been filled with protection, peace, and blessing, as though devotion to God could exist only in comfort, only in prosperity, only in seasons untouched by pain. And slowly, quietly, the challenge was spoken that if the blessings surrounding Job were taken away, his faith would begin to crumble beneath the weight of suffering. Below the heavens, Job knew nothing of this conversation. He did not hear the words being spoken beyond the earth. Nor did he realize that his life was about to change forever. In the land of Uz, the morning sun still rose peacefully across the hills. Shepherds still guided their flocks through open fields, and warm lanterns still glowed softly beside stone homes at night. Life continued as it always had, calm, steady, familiar, yet hidden beneath the stillness of ordinary days. An unseen testing had already begun to move toward him like a distant storm beyond the horizon. And so permission was given, not for the destruction of Job's soul, but for his faith to be tested through suffering. through loss, through silence, and through the kind of pain that leaves the human heart searching desperately for understanding. Still, even as the heavens watched quietly over the earth below, Job remained unaware of what was coming. He continued walking through the peaceful rhythms of his life, speaking gently, praying faithfully, and loving his family beneath the calm skies of Uz, never imagining that the days ahead would soon carry sorrow deeper than anything he had ever known. The morning began like many others in the land of Uz. Calm winds moved gently across the hills. The sun slowly rose over the distant fields, and throughout the countryside, servants carried out the ordinary work of another peaceful day. Sheep grazed quietly upon the open land. Oxen pulled steadily through fertile ground, and travelers moved carefully along the desert roads beneath the growing warmth of the morning light. Nothing around Job seemed unusual. Nothing warned him that sorrow had already begun moving toward his home. Then, sometime during the day, a messenger appeared in the distance, moving quickly across the land with dust trailing behind him. His breathing was heavy, his clothes disordered, and fear covered his face as he approached the house of Job. And when he finally arrived, he spoke words that shattered the calmness of the morning. He told Job that enemies had suddenly attacked the servants working among the oxen and donkeys, taking the animals by force and striking down many of the servants who had been there. Only one had escaped, and that one now stood before Job carrying the terrible news. Before the weight of those words could fully settle upon the room, another messenger arrived, breathless, shaken, overwhelmed with fear. And he spoke of fire falling from the heavens upon the sheep and servants in the fields, consuming everything in its path, leaving destruction behind where peace had once existed. Again, only one servant had survived to bring the news before Job. And while that messenger was still speaking, another appeared in the distance, moving urgently toward the house, carrying yet another wave of sorrow. He spoke of raiders descending suddenly upon the camels, taking them away by force, and killing many of the servants once more. Until again, only one remained alive to speak of what had happened. One messenger after another, sorrow continued arriving without pause, like waves crashing endlessly against the shore. And with each new report, the life Job had known for so many years began slowly collapsing before him. Yet even then, the deepest sorrow had not yet arrived, for another messenger was already approaching through the fading light of the day, carrying news that would wound the heart of Job more deeply than anything before it. As the final messenger approached the house of Job, the air itself seemed heavy with silence. The warmth of the day had begun to fade across the land of Uz, and long shadows stretched quietly across the hills beneath the evening sky, one by one, Every piece of terrible news had already fallen upon Job, like stones carried by an endless storm. His servants, his livestock, his wealth, all taken from him within a single day. Yet standing there in the growing stillness, Job could not have known that an even deeper sorrow was now drawing near. The messenger's voice trembled as he began to speak, for he carried news no father would ever wish to hear. He told Job that his sons and daughters had gathered together inside the home of the eldest brother, sharing a meal, laughing together, enjoying the quiet happiness of being with one another. And while they were there, a great wind swept suddenly across the wilderness, striking the house with terrible force, until the structure collapsed upon everyone inside, leaving no survivors. And after speaking these words, silence filled the air once more. For a moment, everything around Job seemed to stand still. The fields beyond his home, the fading sunlight upon the hills, the distant sounds carried by the evening wind. All of it now felt strangely quiet beneath the weight of unimaginable grief. The children whose voices once filled the nights with laughter were gone. The family gatherings that once brought warmth into his life had vanished in a single moment. And the peace that once surrounded his household now felt painfully distant, like a candle slowly extinguished in darkness. Then Job rose slowly to his feet, overwhelmed by sorrow deeper than words could describe. And in his grief, he tore his robe and lowered himself to the ground, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in mourning, deep and heavy mourning born from a broken heart. For the pain before him was real, the loss unbearable. And the silence surrounding him now felt endless. Yet even in that moment, Job did not curse God. He did not allow grief to completely destroy the faith he had carried throughout his life. And through tears, through confusion, and through sorrow beyond human understanding, Job spoke words that would be remembered for generations. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. As the days passed quietly over the land of ease, sorrow remained heavy upon the life of Job. The laughter that once filled his home had disappeared. The peace that once surrounded his family now felt distant. And the long nights beneath the desert sky had become filled with grief. Yet even in mourning, Job still refused to turn completely away from God. Though his heart was broken, though confusion weighed heavily upon his mind, he continued enduring the silence surrounding him. And once again, beyond the sight of mankind, another conversation unfolded in the heavens. The Lord spoke again of Job, of how he still remained faithful despite everything he had suffered, despite the losses, the sorrow, and the unbearable grief now resting upon his life. But Satan answered once more, saying that a man may endure the loss of possessions, yet still break when suffering reaches his own body. And so, permission was given again, not to take Job's life, but to allow his physical strength to be tested through pain. Soon after, painful sores began appearing across the body of Job, from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. The suffering became constant, deep, exhausting, until even simple rest was difficult to find. The man once respected throughout the land now sat in ashes outside the city. Separated from the comfort of his former life, scraping his wounds with broken pieces of pottery beneath the silence of the open sky. The days became long and the nights even longer. Warm desert winds moved slowly across the earth, while Job remained sitting alone in the ashes. Weakened, grieving, and surrounded by pain, he could not escape. The life he once knew now felt impossibly far away, like a distant memory slowly fading beneath endless sorrow. And during those dark moments, even Job's wife, overwhelmed by grief and suffering herself, spoke from the depths of despair, asking why he continued holding on to his faith after everything that had happened. But Job answered quietly, though pain surrounded every part of his life, reminding her that human beings often accept blessings from God during peaceful seasons, yet struggle to endure when hardship arrives. And even while suffering physically, emotionally, and spiritually, Job still refused to curse God. So there he remained, sitting among the ashes beneath the vast heavens above him, the same stars still shining over the land of Uz, the same winds still moving across the desert hills, while the silence of suffering settled deeply upon his life. And though Job did not yet understand why these things were happening, the testing of his faith had only begun. As news of Job's suffering spread across the surrounding lands, 3 of his friends began traveling from distant places to visit him, for they had heard of the sorrow that had fallen upon his life, the loss of his children, the destruction of everything he once possessed, and the painful affliction now covering his body, and together they journeyed slowly across the desert roads beneath the burning sun, carrying heavy hearts as they approached the land of Uz. These men had known Job during his days of peace and prosperity. They remembered the wise man who once walked confidently through the fields, the respected man whose home had been filled with life, laughter, and blessing. But as they drew closer to the place where Job now sat, they could hardly recognize him, for the suffering had changed him deeply. His body weakened by pain, his spirit crushed beneath grief, his appearance marked by exhaustion and sorrow. And when his friends finally saw him sitting alone among the ashes, they were overcome with emotion. They wept openly tore their robes in mourning and threw dust into the air above their heads as a sign of grief, for the pain before them was far greater than they had imagined. And quietly they sat down beside Job upon the ground. No speeches, no explanations, no answers, only silence. For 7 days and 7 nights, they remained there with him beneath the open skies of the wilderness. While warm winds moved slowly across the earth and the long nights passed beneath the distant stars, and during that time, no one spoke a single word, because they could see that Job's suffering was extremely great. The silence surrounding them felt heavy, almost endless, like a world that no longer knew how to explain pain. The man who once lived surrounded by peace now sat in ashes beneath the weight of unimaginable sorrow, and even his closest friends struggled to understand what had happened to him. As daylight slowly faded each evening, shadows stretched quietly across the desert ground, while small fires flickered softly against the darkness of night. And there, in the stillness, Job remained surrounded not by comfort, not by understanding, but by silence. Deep human silence born from grief too painful for words. Yet beneath that silence, questions had already begun forming within the hearts of everyone sitting there. Questions about suffering, about justice, about God, and soon those questions would slowly begin to rise into the quiet night air. After many days of silence, Job finally began to speak, and as his voice rose softly into the still desert air, the grief he had carried deep within his heart slowly poured outward like water released from a broken vessel. The nights had become painfully long for him. Sleep brought little rest, and each new morning seemed only to return him to the same sorrow, waiting beneath the rising sun. Sitting among the ashes beneath the open sky, Job spoke honestly about the heaviness of his suffering, the loneliness surrounding him, and the confusion filling his thoughts as he searched for understanding. His friends listened carefully at first, the firelight flickering softly beside them, while cool winds drifted quietly through the darkness of the night. Above them, the stars stretched endlessly across the heavens, calm and distant, while below, human hearts wrestled with questions too deep to easily answer. Why does suffering come upon the innocent? Why do seasons of peace suddenly collapse beneath sorrow? Why would a faithful man endure such overwhelming pain? These questions moved slowly through the silence between them, like shadows passing across the desert ground. And one of Job's friends finally answered him, speaking carefully, yet believing deep within himself that suffering must always come as the result of wrongdoing. He suggested that perhaps Job had sinned in some hidden way, that perhaps the sorrow now surrounding his life had been allowed as punishment. And though the words were spoken calmly, they settled heavily upon Job's already wounded heart, for Job knew the sincerity with which he had tried to live before God. And yet even he could no longer fully understand why such suffering had entered his life. As the conversations continued through the following days and nights, each friend offered their own understanding, their own reasoning, their own attempts to explain the mystery of suffering. Sometimes the discussions became emotionally heavy, yet the desert nights remained quiet around them. Lanterns flickered softly beside the ashes. Distant winds crossed the hills beneath the moonlight, and the stars continued shining silently overhead as though watching the sorrow unfolding below. And in the middle of every conversation, Job continued searching for meaning, searching for answers, searching for God within the silence surrounding his pain. There were moments when his faith felt exhausted, moments when grief overwhelmed his thoughts, and moments when the weight of suffering seemed almost impossible to carry. Yet even then, beneath all the confusion, beneath all the sorrow, a small part of Job still longed to understand the God he had faithfully served throughout his life. And so the long nights continued in the land of Uz, filled with questions, reflection, silence, and the slow unfolding of a mystery far greater than any of them could yet comprehend. And the conversations between Job and his friends grew deeper with each passing night. Beneath the open heavens, beside fading fires and drifting desert winds, they spoke about suffering, justice, life, and the mysteries of God that no human mind could fully grasp. At times the voices around Job sounded confident, certain that every hardship must have a clear explanation, certain that pain always arrives as the result of wrongdoing. Yet deep within himself, Job knew that life was often more complicated than human understanding allowed. As the nights became longer, Job's words grew more reflective, more honest, and more filled with the exhaustion of a man carrying unbearable sorrow. He spoke of the loneliness that suffering creates, how pain can make even the brightest days feel distant, and how silence itself can begin to feel heavy upon the human heart. There were moments when Job questioned why life is given to those overwhelmed by grief, moments when he wondered why God sometimes appears silent during seasons of suffering. And yet, even while wrestling with these thoughts, Job continued speaking toward God rather than completely turning away from him. Above them, the stars continued their silent journey across the heavens, untouched by human sorrow, untouched by human confusion. The moonlight rested softly across the desert hills, while cool winds moved gently through the night air. And sitting there among the ashes, Job slowly began realizing something many people never fully understand: that faith is not always the absence of questions. Sometimes faith continues existing, even while the heart struggles to understand. His friends continued answering him, trying to defend their understanding of how the world should work, insisting that suffering must always follow sin, and blessing must always follow righteousness. But the deeper the conversations became, the clearer it appeared that human wisdom alone could not fully explain the mystery standing before them. For life itself often carries sorrow that cannot easily be measured, suffering that cannot easily be explained, and seasons of silence that leave even faithful hearts searching for peace. And through it all, Job remained seated beneath the vast heavens above him, weakened in body, exhausted in spirit, yet still longing to hear from God, not merely for answers, not merely for relief from pain, but to understand whether the God he had faithfully served still saw him within the darkness surrounding his life. And as another quiet night settled across the land of Uz, the fires burned lower beside the ashes, the winds softened across the hills, and somewhere beyond the silence of the earth itself, the moment when God would finally speak was slowly drawing near. The suffering of Job continued through many long days and restless nights. And though conversations surrounded him constantly, true understanding still felt far away. His friends continued searching for explanations, trying to fit human pain into simple answers, believing that every sorrow must have a reason easily understood by the human mind. But the deeper the discussions became, the more exhausted everyone seemed to grow. For some questions are heavier than human wisdom can carry. Job remained seated among the ashes beneath the open sky, weakened by pain, worn down by grief, and surrounded by a silence that often felt deeper than words themselves. The man who once walked confidently through the peaceful fields of Uz now spent his days staring toward distant hills, searching his thoughts, searching his memories, and searching for God within the darkness surrounding his life. At times his heart felt overwhelmed with sorrow, and at other moments, quiet frustration rose within him as he struggled to understand why suffering had entered his life so completely. Yet even while questioning, Job still longed for God, not merely for healing, not merely for restoration, but for understanding, for reassurance, for the comfort of knowing that he had not been abandoned beneath the weight of his pain. And during those long nights, while the desert winds moved softly through the darkness, and the stars stretched endlessly above the earth, Job spoke openly from the depths of his soul. He spoke of human weakness, of how quickly life changes, and of how fragile peace can become within the hands of mankind. One moment life feels stable beneath warm sunlight, and the next, sorrow arrives without warning, like a storm moving silently across the horizon. His friends listened, yet still struggled to fully understand him. They believed suffering should always make sense, that righteousness should always lead to blessing, and that pain must always reveal hidden failure. But the life of Job stood before them as a mystery too deep for human certainty. For sometimes suffering enters even the lives of the faithful, and sometimes silence becomes part of the journey of faith itself. As another evening settled across the land of Uz, the fire beside Job burned softly against the darkness, while cool winds drifted across the silent hills. The conversations slowly faded, the voices became quieter, and the weight of the night seemed to settle gently upon the earth. And there, beneath the endless heavens, Job waited, still grieving, still searching, still hoping, unaware that the moment he had longed for, the moment when God himself would finally speak, was now drawing near. Then, after the long silence, after the endless questions, After the sorrow, the waiting, and the nights filled with grief, something changed in the stillness surrounding Job. The winds began moving differently across the wilderness. The quiet air over the desert shifted softly beneath the heavens, while the skies above seemed to carry a presence far greater than anything human words could describe. And there, in the middle of the vastness surrounding him, God finally spoke, not with the voice of man, not with anger born from human emotion, but with a power, wisdom, and authority beyond the understanding of the earth itself. And as Job listened beneath the open heavens, the Lord began speaking of creation, of the foundations of the world, of oceans, stars, mountains, storms, and the mysteries woven throughout the universe since the beginning of time. Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? The words moved through the silence with overwhelming majesty, yet there was also calmness within them, like the steady voice of eternity itself, speaking across the winds of the wilderness. God spoke of the seas being given boundaries, of morning light spreading across the earth, of snow stored within the heavens, and of stars moving through the night according to their appointed paths. He spoke of powerful creatures roaming the earth, of rivers flowing through hidden valleys, and of the endless wisdom holding creation together in perfect order. And as the voice of God continued across the wilderness, Job slowly realized how small human understanding truly is before the greatness of eternity. For mankind sees only moments, but God sees the beginning and the end together. Mankind understands only fragments, but God understands every hidden thing beneath heaven and earth. The stars above Job continued shining silently across the night sky. The desert winds moved softly through the darkness, and the vastness of creation itself now seemed to surround him differently, no longer as empty silence, but as evidence of a wisdom far beyond human comprehension. God did not fully explain every reason for suffering. He did not reveal every mystery behind pain. Instead, he revealed himself, his power, his wisdom, his authority over all creation. And slowly, beneath the greatness of that moment, Job's heart began changing. The questions that once burned so heavily within him now felt quieter beneath the presence of God. Not because every answer had been given, but because Job now understood that the one guiding creation was greater than the suffering he could not yet understand. And there in the wilderness, beneath the endless heavens, surrounded by winds moving softly across the earth, Job listened quietly as the voice of God continued through the night. For after all the long nights of questioning, after all the grief, confusion, and suffering, Job now understood something deeper than human explanation. He understood how small mankind truly is before the wisdom of God. The questions that once filled his heart so heavily now seemed quieter beneath the presence of the one who created the heavens themselves. And sitting there among the ashes, weakened in body, yet humbled in spirit, Job slowly answered the Lord, not with pride, not with anger, but with humility. He confessed that there were mysteries too great for him to fully understand, things beyond human wisdom, beyond human sight, beyond the limits of earthly understanding. For before this moment, Job had known of God through faith, through prayer, and through the stories passed down across generations. But now, after walking through suffering, silence, and the voice of God within the wilderness, his understanding had become far deeper. The desert night remained calm around him. Cool winds drifted quietly across the earth, while a fire beside him burned softly against the darkness. And as Job reflected upon everything that had happened, the losses, the sorrow, the questions, and the overwhelming presence of God, his heart slowly began finding peace again, not because every pain had disappeared, not because every answer had been revealed, but because he now trusted the wisdom of God even beyond his own understanding. And there in the stillness, the heavy burden upon his soul slowly began to loosen, like the first calm breath after a long storm, like dawn beginning to rise quietly after an endless night. The friends who had once spoken with certainty now remained silent themselves, for they too had witnessed something beyond human reasoning. They had tried to explain suffering through their own understanding, yet now they stood before the greatness of a God whose wisdom reached far beyond the limits of mankind. As the night slowly continued across the land of Uz, Job remained seated beneath the heavens, no longer speaking from frustration, no longer searching desperately for answers, but resting quietly within humility, trusting that even when life becomes painful and unclear, God still remains sovereign over all creation. And though the sorrow of Job's journey had been deep, the story was not yet finished, for beyond the suffering, beyond the silence, and beyond the ashes of loss, restoration was slowly beginning to draw near. As time slowly passed in the land of Uz, the darkness surrounding the life of Job gradually began to lift. The long season of sorrow, silence, and suffering did not disappear all at once, but little by little, peace slowly returned like the first light of dawn appearing after a long night. The desert winds still moved gently across the hills. The stars still watched silently over the earth, and the same God who had carried Job through suffering remained beside him now in the quiet beginning of restoration. The Bible tells us that the Lord restored Job after everything he had endured. His health slowly returned. Strength entered his body once more, and the heaviness that had rested upon his spirit began to soften beneath the mercy of God. Family members and friends gathered around him again, offering comfort, kindness, and support after the painful season he had survived. And though the scars of sorrow remained part of his story, they no longer carried the same crushing weight they once had. Over time, blessings slowly returned to the life of Job. His lands flourished once more beneath the warmth of the sun. Animals again filled the hillsides and valleys, and peace gradually settled across his household, like calm evening light resting upon the earth. The sounds of laughter returned. Conversations once again filled the quiet nights, and life slowly continued forward beneath the endless heavens above Uz. Yet perhaps the greatest restoration was not found in wealth, possessions, or earthly success. It was found within the heart of Job himself. For through suffering, Job had discovered a deeper understanding of faith. He had walked through grief, confusion, silence, and pain, yet even in the darkest moments, God had never truly abandoned him. And though there were questions that remained unanswered, Job now understood that the presence of God could still be trusted, even when life itself became difficult to understand. The years continued peacefully after this. Seasons passed quietly across the land. Mornings arrived softly over the desert hills, and cool evenings settled gently beneath skies filled with stars. And Job lived long enough to once again see peace surrounding his family, to witness new generations growing before him, and to rest beneath the calmness that had finally returned to his life. And so the story of Job slowly comes to its end, not as a story simply about suffering, but as a story about endurance, faith, humility, and the quiet strength of continuing to trust God even during seasons of silence. For sometimes, life brings questions without immediate answers. Sometimes sorrow arrives without warning, and sometimes faith must continue walking forward even through darkness. Yet the story of Job reminds us that suffering is not always the end of the story, that beyond grief, beyond silence, and beyond the long nights of pain, peace can still return again. And now, as the winds move softly across the quiet earth, and the stars continue their silent journey across the heavens above, may your own heart find rest tonight. May peace settle gently over your thoughts. And may you remember, even in seasons that feel uncertain, you are never truly alone. This story reminds us that suffering is not always punishment. Sometimes life becomes painful without warning. Sometimes people who are faithful, honest, and sincere still walk through seasons of grief, confusion, silence, and loss. And one of the deepest lessons found within the story of Book of Job is that pain does not automatically mean God has abandoned someone, because the Bible says in Job 1:1 that Job was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Yet despite his faithfulness, suffering still entered his life. His wealth disappeared, his children were lost, his health was broken, and the peace surrounding his life collapsed almost overnight. And still, even in the middle of sorrow, so deep that words could barely carry it, Job continued searching for God through the silence. The story of Job reminds us that faith is not always loud, strong, or fearless. Sometimes faith looks like continuing forward one painful day at a time. Sometimes faith looks like asking questions while still refusing to completely let go of God. Job cried, mourned, questioned, and wrestled deeply with his suffering. Yet somewhere beneath the grief and confusion, he still held on to hope. And Job says in Job 13:15, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Words spoken not from comfort, but from the middle of suffering itself, showing that even broken hearts can continue reaching toward God during painful seasons. And maybe that is why this story continues touching hearts even today. Because many people understand what it feels like to sit in silence, searching for answers. Many people understand the weight of waiting, the pain of uncertainty, and the exhaustion that comes when life no longer makes sense. Yet the Bible reminds us that silence does not always mean abandonment, because even when Job could not see what God was doing, God still saw Job completely, still knew every sorrow he carried, and still remained sovereign over every part of his journey. Later in the story, Job says in Job 19:25, "I know that my Redeemer lives," a statement of hope spoken in the middle of suffering, not after it. And in the end, the story of Job reminds us that suffering is not always the end of the story. Healing may come slowly, peace may return little by little, and understanding may not arrive all at once. But darkness does not last forever, because beyond the grief, beyond the ashes, and beyond the long nights of pain, restoration slowly found its way back into the life of Job. And the Bible says in Job 42:12, "The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning," reminding us that even after deep sorrow, God is still able to restore, heal, and bring peace again.